Hello friends, I am Aditi. Welcome to my channel Library Mouse. Today I am going to read a book, How to Develop Self-Confidence and Influence People by Public Speaking by Dale Carnegie. This book contains 12 chapters, so let's start with chapter 1, Developing Courage and Self-Confidence. More than 500,000 men and women since 1912 have been members of public speaking courses using my methods. Many of them have written statements telling why they enrolled for this training and what they hope to obtain from it. Naturally, the phraseology varied, but the central desire is these letters. The basic want in the vast majority remains surprisingly the same. When I am called upon to stand up and speak, person after person wrote, I become so self-conscious, so frightened that I can't think clearly, can't concentrate, can't remember what I had instead to say. I want to gain self-confidence, poise, and the ability to think on my feet. I want to get my thoughts together in logical order, and I want to be able to say my say clearly and convincingly before a business or club group or audience. Thousands of their confession sounded about like that. To cite a concrete case, years ago, a gentleman here called Mr. D.W. Jain joined my public speaking course in Philadelphia. Shortly after the opening session, he invited me to lunch with him in the Manufacturers Club. He was a man of middle age and had always led an active life, was head of his own manufacturing establishment, a leader in church work and civic activities. While we were having lunch that day, he leaned across the table and said, I have been asked many times to talk before various gatherings, but I have never been able to do so. I got so confused, my mind becomes an utter blank, so I have sidestepped it all my life. But I am chairman now of a board of college trustees. I must preside at their meetings. I simply have to do some talking. Do you think it will be possible for me to learn to speak at this late date in my life? Do I think, Mr. Jain? I replied, it is not a question of my thinking. I know you can, and I know you will, if you will only practice and follow the direction and instruction. He wanted to believe that, but it seemed too rosy, too optimistic. I am afraid you are just being kind, he answered, that you are merely trying to encourage me. After he had completed his training, we lost touch with each other for a while. Later, we met and lunched together again at the Manufacturers Club. We sat in the same corner and occupied the same table that we had on the first occasion, reminding him of our former conversation. I asked him if I had been too sanguine. Then he took a little red-backed notebook out of his pocket and showed me a list of talks and dates for which he was booked. And the ability to make this, he confessed, the pleasure I get in doing it, the additional service I can render to the community, these are among the most gratifying things in my life. An important disarmament conference had been held in Washington shortly before that. When it was known that the British Prime Minister was planning to attend it, from among all the Baptists of that city to introduce England's primer to the audience, and this was the man who had sat at the same table less than 3 years before and solemnly asked me if I thought he would ever be able to talk in public. Was the rapidity with which he forged ahead in his speaking ability unusual? Not at all. There have been hundreds of similar cases. For example, to quote one more specific instance, years ago, a Brooklyn physician, whom we will call Dr. Curtis, spent the winter in Florida near the training grounds of the Gaines. Being an enthusiastic baseball fan, he often went to see them practice. In time, he became quite friendly with the team and was invited to attend a banquet given in their honor. After the coffee and nuts were served, several prominent guests were called upon to say a few words. Suddenly, with the abruptness and unexpectedness of an explosion, he heard the Toastmaster remark, we have a physician with us tonight, and I am going to ask Dr. Curtis to talk on a baseball player's health. Was he prepared? Of course. He had the best preparation in the world. He had been studying hygiene and practicing medicine for almost a third of century. He could have sat in his chair and talked about the subject all night to the men seated on his right or left. But to get up and say the same thing to even a small audience, that was another matter. That was a paralyzing matter. His heart doubled its pace and skipped beat at the very contemplation of it. He had never made a public speech in his life, and even thought that he had now took wings. What was he to do? The audience was applauding. Everyone was looking at him. He shook his head, but that served only to heighten the applause. To increase the demand, the cries of Dr. Cutie's speech, speech grew louder and more insistent. He was in positive misery. He knew that if he got up, he should fail, that he would be unable to utter half a dozen sentences. So he arose and without saying a word, turned his back on his friends and walked silently out of the room, a deeply embarrassed and humiliated man. Small wonder that one of the first thing he did after getting back to Brooklyn was to enroll in my course in public speaking. He did not propose to be put to the blush and be stricken dumb a second time. He was the kind of a student that delights an instructor. He was indeed earnest. He wanted to be able to talk, and there was no half-heartedness about his desire. He prepared his talks thoroughly, he practiced them with a will, and he never missed a single session of the course. He did precisely what such a student always does. He progressed at a rate that surprised him, that surpassed his fondest hopes. After the first few sessions, his nervousness subsided. His confidence mounted higher and higher. In 2 months, he had become the star speaker of the group. He was soon expecting invitations to speak elsewhere. He now loved the feel and exhilaration of it, the distinction and the additional friends it brought him. A member of the New York City Republican Campaign Committee, hearing one of his public addresses, invited Dr. Curtis to stump the city for his party. How surprised that politician would have been had he realized that only a year before the speaker had gotten up and left a public banquet hall in shame and confusion because he was tongue-tied with audience fear. The gaining of self-confidence and courage and the ability to think calmly and clearly while talking to a group is not one-tenth as difficult as most people imagine. It is not a gift bestowed by Providence on only a few rarely endowed individuals. It is like the ability to play golf. Anyone can develop his own latent capacity if he has sufficient desire to do so. Is there the faintest shadow of a reason why you should not be able to think as well in a perpendicular position before an audience as you can when sitting down? Surely you know there is not. In fact, you ought to think better when facing a group. Their presence ought to stir you and lift you. A great many speakers will tell you that the presence of an audience is a stimulus and inspiration that drives their brains to function more clearly and more keenly. At such time, thought, fact, ideas that they did not know they possessed drift smoking by, as Henry Ward Beecher said, and they have but to reach out and lay their hands hot upon them. They ought to be your experiences. It probably will be if you practice and preserve. Of this much, however, you may be absolutely sure. Training and practice will wear away your audience fright and give you self-confidence and an abiding courage. Do not imagine that your case is usually difficult. Even those who afterward become the most eloquent representatives of their generation were, at the outset of their careers, affiliated by this binding fear and self-consciousness. William Jennings Bryan, battle-marked veteran that he was, admitted that in his first attempts his knees fairly smote together. Mark Twain, the first time he stood up to lecture, felt as if his mouth were filled with cotton and his pulse were speeding for some prize cup. Grant took Vicksburg and led to victory, one of the greatest armies the world had ever seen up to that time. Yet, when he attempted to speak in public, he admitted he had something very like locomotor ataxia. The late Jean Jaurès, the most powerful political speaker that France produced during his generation, sat for a year, tongue-tied in the Chamber of Deputies before he could summon up the courage to make his initial speech. The first time I attempted to make a public talk, confessed L. Lloyd George, I tell you, I was in a state of misery. It is no figure of speech, but literally true, that my tongue clove to the roof of my mouth, and at first I could hardly get out of a word. John Bright, the illustrious Englishman, who during the Civil War defended in England the cause of union and emancipation, made his maiden speech before a group of country flock gathered in a school building. He was so frightened on the way to the place, so fearful that he would fail, that he implored his companion to start applause to bolster him up whenever he showed signs of giving way to his nervousness. Charles Stewart Parnell, the great East leader at the outset of his speaking career, was so nervous, according to the testimony of his brother, that he frequently clenched his fists until his nails sank into the flesh and his palms bled. Disraeli admitted that he would rather have led a cavalry charge than to have faced the House of Commons for the first time. His opening speech there was a ghastly failure, so was Sheridan's. In fact, so many of the famous speakers of England have made poor showings at first that there is now a feeling in Parliament that it is rather an inauspicious omen for a young man's initial talk to be a decided success, so take heart. After watching the careers and aging somewhat in the development of so many speakers, the author is always glad when a student has at the outset a certain amount of flutter and nervous agitations. There is a certain responsibility in making a talk, even if it is to only 24 men or women in a business meeting. A certain strain, a certain shock, a certain excitement. The speaker ought to be keyed up like a thoroughbred straining at the bit. The immortal Cicero said 2000 years ago that all public speaking of real merit was characterized by nervousness. Speakers often experience this same feeling even when they are talking over the radio. Microphone fright, it is called. When Charlie Chaplin went on the air, he had his speech all written out. Surely he was used to audience. He toured his country back in 1912 with a vaudeville Valley sketch entitled A Night in a Music Hall. Before that, he was on the legitimate stage in England. Yet, when he went into the padded room and faced the microphone, he had a feeling in the stomach not unlike the sensation one gets when he crosses the Atlantic during a stormy February. James Kirkwood, a famous motion picture actor and director, had a similar experience. He used to be a star on the speaking stage, but when he came out of the sending room after addressing the invisible audience, he was mopping perspiration from his brow. An opening night on Broadway, he confessed, is nothing in comparison of that. Some people, no matter how often they speak, always experience this self-consciousness just before they commence, but in a few seconds after they have gotten on their feet, it disappears. Even Lincoln felt shy for the few opening moments. At first he was very awkward, relates his law partner, Hendon, and it seemed a real labor to adjust himself to his surroundings. He struggled for a time under a feeling of apparent diffidence and sensitiveness, and these only added to his awkwardness. I have often seen and sympathized with Mr. Lincoln during these moments. When he began speaking, his voice was shrill, peeping, and unpleasant. His manner, his attitude, his dark, yellow face, wrinkled and dry, his oddity of pose, his different movements, everything seemed to be against him. But only for a short time. In a few moments, he gained composure and warmth and earnestness, and his real speech began. Your experience may be similar to his. In order to get the most out of your efforts to become a good speaker in public and to get it with rapidity and dispatch, 4 things are essential. Here this is half a part of chapter 1. In next video, we will continue this. Thank you so much for listening it, and I hope it is understandable to you. If you enjoy watching my videos, do like, subscribe and share with your family and friends. Thank you.